equipment in here. Start bringing my laptop.
Everybody ready? Good. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lawrence City Commission meeting. We have no proclamations tonight, so we'll go directly to the consent agenda. All matters listed below on the consent agenda are considered under one motion and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion on those items. If discussion is desired, that item will be removed from the consent agenda and will be considered separately. Members of the public wishing to speak to an item that's been pulled off the consent agenda will be limited to 3 minutes for comments. Is there anything that a member of the commission would like to pull off the consent agenda?
No.
Is there anything a member of the public would like to pull off of the consent agenda? Okay. I'd entertain a motion.
Move that we approve the items on the consent agenda, including claims.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Ananda, second from Commissioner Herbert. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Thank you. Next, we'll move on to public comment. The public is allowed to speak to any items or issues except those scheduled on the consent agenda or the regular agenda portions of the agenda after first being recognized by the mayor. Each person will be limited to 3 minutes for public comment. As a general practice, the Commission will not discuss or debate these items, nor will the Commission make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they will refer the items to staff for follow-up if necessary. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in, and state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments and questions to the Commission. So we're open for public comment.
Hi, my name's Sarah Merriman. I live at 6212 West 22nd Court. Last week there was quite a bit of discussion about the amount of time it takes to get through funding, through design, to completion of stormwater projects. This chart lets us see this visually, and I like to see things visually, so I thought maybe you would too as well. Laid out two scenarios here, going from last week when you adopted the 2019 budget to when the budget 2020 budget process starts. From that would be 7 months time from when the budget 2020 budget would be adopted, hopefully including project 23 would be 12 months. Surveying, engineering, and design starts. And if it was the 6-month timeline, that would be completed in 23 months. And if that was the 12-month timeline, it would be 29 months. Utility moving, if it was 3 months, it would be 26. And if it was 12 months, it would be in 41 months. The rerouting of the storm sewer starting, that would be completed if it was the 9-month time frame, 35 months. And if it was a 12-month time frame, it would be 53 months time lapse between from when the budget was approved last week to completion of Project 23 and the remediation of the flooding we discussed last week. I was pleased to hear the Commission recommend that Project 23 be given higher priority as the overall Jayhawk watershed drainage system is evaluated. Project 23 needs to be completed in as short a time as possible, And since it appears to be the most downstream portion of the Jayhawk watershed area that's not been upgraded, it would make sense that it be completed first. I would ask that this study start immediately, and if it is to be determined that Project 23 would be worked first, that the engineering and design be expedited so that construction can begin as soon as funding is available. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Donna Giesler, and I live at 6212 West 22nd Court. From 2006 through 2016, stormwater fee revenues were $32 million. In addition, at some point, several bonds were issued to be used by multiple departments. It is unclear how much debt proceeds were directed for stormwater, but debt service of almost $10 million was paid from stormwater revenue during that period. That left $22 million of stormwater revenue to be spent on operations for maintenance of stormwater lines, since no capital projects from the master plan were worked during that time period. During the same period, there were transfers of $5 million out of the stormwater fund to the general fund. It appears that a shift in priorities took place during this 11-year period to focus on maintenance rather than focusing on the capital projects called for in the master plan. It would be appropriate to ask for a review of how these dollars were spent to determine how stormwater department priorities changed during this time period. This chart shows the capital improvement projects proposed to be funded by Stormwater Fund from 2018 budget and the recently approved 2019 budget. The first line shows CIP dollars of $700,000 going toward contracted street maintenance program. I have added the second line from the operations budget that shows the money being transferred out to pay for street curbs. These two items total $3 million and appear to be funding street maintenance versus stormwater maintenance. The next line shows the purchases of street sweepers, which are not addressed in the master plan study. Are these stormwater maintenance equipment, and how were they funded before the stormwater fee was implemented? The next section shows equipment purchases totaling $1.2 million. The question would be, are these used for stormwater maintenance or for stormwater construction? Could this type of equipment be utilized by the larger Public Works Department and have the cost shared? The next line shows stormwater culvert lining. Is this material cost to maintain stormwater lines, and is it performed by the stormwater crews? Is this standard amount needed each year? Are expenditures tracked, since it's $250,000 every year? The last section shows capital construction projects. 13th and Brook Drainage was a Group 3, but was recategorized to a Group 1 project due to structure flooding, as we have asked that Project 23 be recategorized. The Naismith and Arrowhead projects weren't part of the master plan. Have they been evaluated using the master plan criteria to be Group 1 priority projects? Mr. Bond said last week that all these projects would be evaluated for priority need. I hope this can be accomplished before next year's budget discussions, and that issuing of more bonds be considered. May I finish my last sentence, sir?
Yes.
Thank you. And that issuing of more bonds be considered for the funding of additional projects to make the master plan a priority again. Thank you very much for allowing me to talk. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Other public comment? Okay. We'll now move on to the regular agenda items. First item, we have a public hearing to open and defer. I guess we just go ahead and do that.
Yes, open the hearing,
Okay.
which is still required even though the intention is to defer.
Okay. So we will open the public hearing for the purpose of receiving explanation and supporting documentation related to proposals from the City of Lawrence and members of the Lawrence Police Officers Association concerning wages and/or fringe benefits and/or working conditions, and render a decision by accepting one party's proposal. So I would ask for a motion to open a public hearing.
I move to open the public hearing.
Second.
We have a motion from Vice Mayor Larson, second from Commissioner Ananda to open the public hearing. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, and the direction that we have is that it's okay and beneficial to defer until August 21st.
For the public record, it's believed that we have an understanding with the LPOA as to the remaining terms, and as a result, we're recommending that this matter be deferred until next Tuesday. In the interim, the LPOA will be reviewing the contractual document and determine whether they will ratify or not.
Thank you for that explanation.
Sure.
So I'd entertain a motion to defer to the August 21st, 2018 City Commission meeting.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Herbert, second from Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
So that hearing is now deferred. Thanks. Our next item is to consider a motion to recess into executive session.
I move that we recess into executive session.
For approximately,
20 minutes? Yeah, for approximately 20 minutes.
and this is to discuss pending legal.
Sorry, what was that? Oh, just
Yeah,
read it.
just read the
Okay.
whole thing.
Okay. I move that we recess into executive session for approximately 20 minutes to discuss pending legal matters involving the city pursuant to the exceptions set forth in KSA 75-4319B1 for consultation with attorneys for the city, which would be deemed privileged in the attorney-client relationship. The justification for the executive session is to keep attorney-client privilege matters confidential at this time. At the end of the executive session, the city commission will resume its regular meeting in the commission room.
So we have a motion.
Second.
Okay, motion from Vice Mayor Larson, second from Commissioner Herbert. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. 20 minutes. And we have nothing to report. On to commission items. Do we have commission items this evening?
Nope.
Okay. Calendar.
Do we already have on there the KU football game? It doesn't look like it.
That's September 1st.
September 1st.
And I don't know if I'll still be able to make the graduation Friday. Maybe it's already on there, but.
I'll be
Yeah,
there.
we should add that. Saturday, September 1st. I think the event starts at 4
Yeah.
at the Chancellor's house. So.
And it's a ticketed
Yeah.
event.
Correct. And I don't know if any of you found out if you were going to be at the Just Food event on Thursday the 23rd, but
Not after all. No.
okay. Never mind, there aren't 3 of us then.
I won't be able to either.
Anything else for calendar? Okay. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I would make a motion to adjourn and move into the work session.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Herbert, second Commissioner Nanda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. We're on to the work session. Work session provides an opportunity for the City Commission to discuss items in greater detail. As a general practice, the Commission will not make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they will refer the items to staff for follow-up if necessary. Public comment related to the work session topics will be allowed at the end of the discussion on each item. Each person will be limited to 3 minutes for public comment. So our first is on the Lawrence Douglas County Fire Medical Accreditation.
Did you give her that?
Mayor and Commissioners, my name is Sean Coffey, and I'm currently serving as the interim fire chief for the Lawrence Douglas County Fire Medical Department. Before I get Division Chief Fagan up here to give you some really in-depth information, I just want to have a brief statement with you. Last Thursday, we were recognized for the 3rd time as an internationally accredited department by the Center of Public Safety Excellence. We are one of the 247 internationally accredited fire agencies. Just as a point of reference, there's about 27,000 fire departments in the United States. So we're pretty proud of being one of the 247. Accreditation is a performance based upon a model for continuous organizational improvement. Obtaining accredited status is an international recognition of achievement. It shows our community that its fire medical department is performing towards industry standards, best practices, and is holding itself accountable through an external review. The process is an extensive review of every aspect of the organization, such as HR, operations, EMS, water supply, emergency communications, and governance. There are 10 categories for review with 250 performance indicators. All the department members were an integral part of this process and its success. I'd be remiss not to mention how grateful we are for their support. We could also not have completed the process without the assistance of our many external partners. The willingness to provide information and support is appreciated throughout the city and county. We'd also like to thank the City Commission and the City Manager's Office for their support. Without your support, we would not be able to continue our journey for continuous quality improvement. I would also like to mention Fire Chief Mark Bradford. He was instrumental in starting this process 15 years ago, and his foresight and leadership will be missed. While you often hear that we need more personnel, equipment, stations, and apparatus, the accreditation model drives our recommendations for continuous improvement rooted in community expectations. Thank you for your opportunity to share this information. Tom Fagan, our Division Chief of Administration and Accreditation Manager, is now going to provide you with some additional details. We have updated the presentation, and with all the information in the materials, if you could hold your questions until the end, it will allow all the materials to be presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Chief Fagan.
Good evening. My name is Tom Fagan, Division Chief of Administration. Tonight we're going to go over, briefly, a lot of information for you. I'm not sure in the past if a lot of this information may have been shared to you in regards to key performance indicators associated with the fire accreditation model. First, we're going to talk about the community-driven strategic planning process. That's a requirement, and also the community risk assessment and standards of cover. We're not going to get into another major element, which are the key performance indicators of the accreditation model itself from the FESM. There's over 250 performance indicators, but they are available on our website if you'd like to reference those. Those are the items that Chief Coffey was referring to, associated with HR, external resources, fire suppression. A lot of the detail goes into those documents, but those are available on our webpage. So there we go. Okay, we're going to start with our strategic planning process. And so one thing that's unique about our strategic plan is that it's community-driven. Community-driven meaning that we had external stakeholders involved, specifically about 40 external stakeholders from our community. We gathered information from them. A key important element of this is that it was facilitated by the Center for Public Safety Excellence. They hosted this gathering of these people, gathered information from them in regards to prioritization of services, what the community's expectations are of our organization, areas of concern, a SWOT analysis, and also information that we utilize to develop our mission, vision, and values for the future. Ultimately, we developed strategic goals over the next 5 years for us to work towards meeting those. This strategic plan is updated every spring as it relates to how we're attacking those strategic initiatives and moving forward. We're going to get into some of the information that was gathered in that document. We did have the strategic plan available in the council packet, the commission packet, to review. There's a lot of information in there. We're not going to include all of that tonight in this, just some key elements. But I wanted to talk to the top 5 community expectations and how it relates to our planning processes as an organization. So you'll see that the number 1 item on here is rapid response time. We're going to get a lot into response times tonight, how it relates to quality response, quality outcomes for the community. That's the number 1 expectation. It goes into training professional people current on their certifications as an expectation. Also, developing community educational opportunities, being prepared for heightened state of emergency, and up-to-date technology to provide efficient, effective outcomes. You're going to see more information about that this evening. And now information related to our community's concerns, and this is verbatim from that assessment. Number 1 on there, they're currently pleased with the fire department's product. Funding context was identified in the future, concern that we'll have the fiscal ability to properly support and equip the department to provide the service expectations. There's discussion in there about code enforcement being too much by the book and how that impacts economic development for growth and building. Talks about in a growing community concerned with the ability to provide fast response as we currently do. Will we be spread too thin was the comment that was in there. And then also not enough funding or focus on community education, fire prevention, and risk reduction. So you're going to see elements from that incorporated into a lot of our planning processes, and they were also incorporated into the assessment by the Commission on Fire Accreditation International. Ultimately, later in the presentation, when we get into the recommendations that the Commission had for us. So talking about a community risk assessment and standards of cover. First of all, the community risk assessment is a study of fire and non-fire hazards and risks unique specifically to our community in Douglas County. It recognizes pertinent facts which influence risk in order to develop the standards of cover. So the standards of cover are those policies and procedures of our coverage for the fire medical resources for the City of Lawrence and the rest of Douglas County. The standards of cover are standards that are reflective of the hazards and risks specific to the community risk assessment. Okay, so this is the first map of several that we're going to go over tonight. But this first one shows in context as it relates to the standards of cover for fire medical resources in the City of Lawrence and Douglas County. I want to make sure I get my mouse here ready. Okay, very good. Okay, so 4 core operational programs that we provide are fire suppression, emergency medical services, technical rescue, and hazardous materials. Now, those are just 4 of numerous programs that we provide, but these are the 4 core operational programs. Some other programs, for example, are coroner services, fire prevention, fire investigation, public education. These are all just examples of several other programs that we do. So fire suppression within the city of Lawrence and Grant Township is, you'll see these logos here, these little fire symbols that are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are the fire stations that are strategically positioned within the city of Lawrence. Very well designed for distribution of resources, trying to spread those out for equal coverage of the geographic area, and you'll see how that relates to performance here in a minute. Within each one of those fire stations, we have 6 fire apparatus that are staffed daily, and 1 shift commander, who is the fire chief that's on duty. Outside the city limits, you'll see 2 additional stations. This station down here, you'll notice the symbol is different. This is a Star of Life, which is indicative for emergency medical services. We have an ambulance station down here in Baldwin, and we have an ambulance stationed out here in Eudora. We also have ambulances stationed within each of the fire stations within the city of Lawrence. So as far as scope, in regards to what program is provided where, that's important to understand as it relates to performance and what resources are available. Fire suppression, so to think of fire suppression, a building fire, car fire, something like that, that is being provided within the city of Lawrence and Grant Township by contractual agreement. Outside the walls of the city of Lawrence and Grant Township, we provide emergency medical services for the city of Lawrence and Grant Township, but also the entire county of Douglas County. We provide technical rescue services. Technical rescue services would be like swiftwater rescue, water rescue, vehicle extrication if we need to cut apart a car to get somebody out in a motor vehicle collision, a rope rescue, something along those lines. We do that for the entire county. We also provide hazardous materials response for the entire county. So what is fire medical protecting? Here are some pieces of information as it relates to risk, the number of people, and the appraised value of property that we're protecting. We feel like these are some big numbers. Nearly 100,000 people within the city of Lawrence, and that's not including visitors. 120,000 within Douglas County, and then property looking at almost $1.8 billion of appraised value. So what's gone on historically in regards to the standards of cover, our ability to provide quality response to stop loss on incidents? This trend chart is evaluating a period of time which began in 2006. And the reason 2006 was looked at was that was the last operational expansion. That was Fire Station number 5 located at 19th and Iowa. In that station we have a ladder truck, an ambulance, and a shift commander. So that's where the chief is located. We also have our rescue there. Since that time, through 2017, we've had just under 40% increase in call volume. And so those are operational increase in calls. So those are emergencies. Those are not the fire prevention activities. Those aren't the public education. Those aren't the other things that are occurring within our organization that influence the movement of our resources around the community. Over this time, our workforce has reduced within the city, but the department budget has increased over time, maintaining quality service countywide. An example of that is we did have an expansion in 2017. The addition of the ambulance in the city of Eudora was an expansion, but it was not within the city of Lawrence. This year in 2018, we're projected to add an additional 5% in emergency incidents. So where is that increase in calls happening? And that's kind of what we're getting into next. You can see where the incidents have occurred just in the last 5 years, from 2013 through 17. That the majority of the incidents, 87% of the incidents, are occurring within the city of Lawrence. The other 13% of incidents are occurring in the rest of the county. So, for example, the number of calls within the city of Lawrence last year in 2017, 10,903, and the rest of the county was 1,000 1,633. Okay, so this is a deeper dive. Now that we've talked about calls in the county and calls in the city, now we're looking at some planning zones specifically. And these planning zones align with the location of our fire stations. And so where the cursor is, you'll see where as I'm pointing to these planning zones, and they're shaded in different colors. These different colors align with a heat map type of methodology. The darker the red, the more increase in the volume of calls of the last 5 years. So you'll be able to see the difference in trending on calls. For example, Planning Zone 3, which is where my cursor is right now in the red, you'll see that since 2013 to last year, that planning zone has increased 620 incidents just within that planning zone. That's important as we look towards the future for planning purposes to make sure that we're able to provide high quality response and reliability of resources, which we'll get into a little bit more as well. What I also want to identify to you here is that Planning Zone 1, which is in the downtown area here, has had almost a 10% increase in volume. This is our highest demand planning zone. In 2013, we were just under 3,500 calls, and in 2017, just over 3,800 calls, with an increase of 331 calls that year. So talking about some outcomes, over the last 5 years, we measure output and outcomes. Looking at our EMS coverage on high-risk EMS. So high-risk EMS events for us are cardiac arrest events. Cardiac arrest with a return of spontaneous circulation or a pulse. Based on our response right now, over the last 5 years, we're performing at 31.5% of the time. And that is on all cardiac arrest. You'll see on here we mention the Utstein criteria. Utstein is a like data comparison that we've joined a registry to do some comparison against. Utstein criteria would include a witnessed cardiac arrest with a shockable rhythm upon arrival. And so when we're doing like comparisons with other communities, we would be able to see what our performance is against those communities when they have the same like comparison. The challenge is, when looking at Utstein, if you have a delayed response quality, that shockable rhythm may not be there, even though it may have been a witnessed arrest because of the length of time. So it's important that we look at both in the future, all arrests, but also look at Utstein to see how we're comparing against those other agencies when we're put in that position of success. On high-risk fires, the measurement of outcomes that we're showing here are flame spread as it relates to damage in the building. So from the top going down, if the fire upon extinguishment was confined to the object of origin, or if the fire had extended beyond the building of origin upon extinguishment. And so you'll see the data there as it relates to the outcome. One thing that's important to keep in mind here is, and we'll get into it more here in a second, is that the outcome directly correlates with the condition upon arrival of our resources. For example, if a fire has extended beyond the room of origin into the floor of origin, there's no way that we can take that fire and flame damage back from where it is grown from. Time is critical. Whether it's a fire, emergency medical call, rescue, or hazardous materials release, time is critical to rapidly changing factors associated with incident mitigation and its outcome. Outcomes of these events correlate to the condition of the hazard or illness upon the arrival of our resources. Strategies, tactics, and tasks for mitigation are correlated to those conditions. Those conditions develop into an organized incident action plan for our mitigation. Numerous factors affect the condition upon arrival. Some of them are controllable, others are not. So this is a table which talks about critical tasks, and we're required as an accredited agency to do a critical task analysis. A critical task analysis breaks down what tasks your resources are performing on different event types. So this critical task assessment is looking at high-risk fire for us. For us, a high-risk fire is a structure fire. And so we mobilize resources to address these critical tasks. So these are the minimum amount of staffing and equipment that must reach a specific emergency zone within a maximum prescribed total response time that are capable of initial fire suppression, EMS, or other hazard mitigation. So this answers that question simply. You know, if there's a fire in the community, many people wonder, why are there so many fire trucks there? You know, if there's a fire station down the street. Well, that is true, but the fire apparatus is the vehicle and the tools with the pump, the fire hose, some water, and 4 firefighters to address the hazard that exists. That one fire truck may be able to handle a car fire with the critical tasks that are required to handle that. But when we start talking about a building fire, a hotel fire, larger buildings, all of the tasks that need to be addressed and need to be addressed as simultaneously as possible in order for the optimal outcome need to happen quickly. We just don't need that first unit there. We need all the units that are required to address all these critical tasks there as quickly as possible. So in this example, you'll see for a high-risk structure fire, our effective response force, which is a key term you'll see here in a minute, effective response force, is 2 fire trucks, 2 ambulances, a rescue, and 1 chief. And so remember on the resources in regards to capabilities and capacities, how one structure fire influences the capabilities and limitations of our resources within the community. So how do we measure response time? We measure our response time as required by the Commission on Fire Accreditation at the 90th percentile. Our benchmarks and our baselines are measured as such. So this is based on industry consensus standards consistent with the National Fire Protection Association, and also a station turnout study, which we've done internally to show what our turnout time capabilities are based on building construction. The 2 consensus standards specifically within NFPA that talk about these standards are NFPA 1221 and NFPA 1710. So digging into response time, you heard me talk earlier about total response time. There are components of total response time. Think of total response time as hello to hello. When the dispatcher is picking up the phone when you call 911 until a firefighter or a paramedic is at your door talking to you face to face. That is total response time. So we break up several elements of that in order to dig into if there's any room for improvement to speed up that process, because there are numerous processes. The first one is alarm handling. These are the processes that occur at the dispatch center. So this starts when the dispatcher answers 911 and ends when a fire medical unit is dispatched. So this is how long does it take to locate the call, gather information from the caller, and dispatch the closest appropriate unit to the location. Turnout time is the next segment. Turnout time is when the fire medical unit is notified and ends when the wheels are turning and they are actually responding to the incident. The next is travel time. After the wheels are turning, how long does it take for that resource to arrive at the emergency location? And then total response time is the sum of those elements. One item that's in here I want to get into a little bit more is travel time. A couple slides ago we were talking about effective response force. Travel time as it relates to the effective response force is another element that we measure, not just the first arriving resource, but all of the resources to get there, because ultimately it just isn't one that provides the optimal outcome. It's the effective response force. The sooner we can get all of those tasks addressed, the better the outcome. So this table is a sample of what you're going to see here in a minute with our actuals historically. These are the benchmarks that are in our urban areas. Our urban planning zones, you heard me talk about the planning zones previously, the 5 planning zones within the city of Lawrence. Our urban planning zones are the city of Lawrence, the city of Eudora, Baldwin City, and this is based on the population density within those locations. Okay, so this is where we get into some actuals, and we have some historical information in here as well as it relates to the trend in performance for total response time. And so this data is relative to structure fires specifically. So if we'll start at the left side, you'll see that those are the descriptors of the components of total response time: alarm handling, turnout, travel time of the first unit, and then travel time of the effective response force. And these benchmarks, like I said, are based on consensus standards from NFPA. So moving to the right side of the chart, the far right column is some historical standards of cover performance. And as you move to the left, you'll see the SOC that was included, 2012 through 2016. The data that was just published in our most recent standards of cover is identified there. Since that time, we were able to include 2017 data, which is as you move even further to the left. So you'll see that there's some areas where we have improved, and based on several factors, we believe, are influencing our ability to provide moving further and further from the benchmark. Specifically, you can see in the red under the performance trend from the SOC to the SOC what that looks like, and then into 2017 the change that is occurring there. The same table with the same design. This is our EMS calls. So all of these are emergency incidents, and you can see that the alarm handling has improved, but that we still have some ways to go from the benchmark. Our turnout time, we're right on where our internal benchmark is, but the travel time of the first unit is impacted here. We did have an increase in 2017. You'll see that the change from the 2012 to 2016 SOC, travel time of the first unit was 6 minutes and 35 seconds at the 90th percentile. In 2017, we were faster. Well, in 2017, I believe it was in February, we added the ambulance in the city of Eudora. So if you're looking at the pool of resources to be able to utilize in urban areas, that was an increase in capacity to address that need. Okay, so here's our next map. This map really shows a lot of information together. This is looking at where are we meeting our benchmarks as it relates to travel time on structure fires, and where aren't we? As you would imagine, the closer in proximity you would see from fire stations for the first driving unit of the fire apparatus, the darker the blue, with the shade of the blue, at greater than 75%, that's where we're meeting our travel time benchmarks. As the shade goes to a darker pink color, almost to a purple, that is the trend in slower response. In addition to that, you're seeing some new building permits as it relates to community growth from 2012 to 2016. And I have to give some kudos to the IT department, specifically Micah Siebold and Jim Wisdom. This is the work that they've worked with us on to produce some fantastic maps related to GIS and our performance data. So we're very thankful for their support. But you can see along the western wall, the northwestern area there, in regards to growth, we are seeing some challenges in quality response time for the first driving unit. So reliability, breaking down the planning zones within the city, where are we meeting those response time benchmarks and how often? And so this breaks it down citywide. If you look to the far right end of the table, citywide, we're meeting the benchmark 58% of the time. And you'll see the data set there is 964 records. The percentage trend that's below there in parentheses is incorporating the additional year of 2017. This same table is in the standards of cover, but it's from one less year historically. So it's from 2012 to 2016. This is the trend one more year in the future. So you can see that in the majority of the planning zones, we are trending less reliable based on performance. So a similar map, you'll see the fire stations as the red dots. Again, I know there's a lot of information on this map. First of all, I want to bring your attention, I'm going to use my cursor here. There it is. There's a light shade that's a polygon that kind of covers the entire city, and I'm outlining it right now with my cursor. So what this shade is representing is using an Esri GIS tool for a travel time polygon at 4 minutes. So when I was mentioning that a strategic design of station placement for 4-minute coverage historically has been done spot on. Based on that design, using technology, we should be able to provide 4-minute travel time But again, that's using a technology tool that is a perfectly sunny day, no rain, no snow, no traffic, no construction, and every one of these units is available and in their fire station 100% of the time. And so by design, this is an excellent design. The challenge is that there are numerous elements that influence those resources to be able to provide that. So the dots that are on here and the different shades of those dots are reflective of what is happening based on actual historical data. The blue dots are showing where we did meet benchmarks, and you can see that they're distributed, throughout the community. The yellow dots are at 4 minutes to 6 minutes, and the orange larger dots are where we have over 6 minute response time for the first arriving fire apparatus. You'll see that even in very close proximity to our fire stations, that's happening. And the reason that is happening, we believe, is that first due unit most likely was not available on those incidents. They were tied up doing another incident or another task, and were not available to respond to provide that travel time response for that shaded coverage area. So then you're relying on the next fire station that's closest, or depending on drawdown, even the next furthest resource to provide that response quality. Looking to the future, this is information that we got from city planning. You can see from 2020 to 2030 where the growth, and I believe you've probably seen some of this information in another presentation, but this is showing the population growth projections from 2020 to 2030. But it's also showing, remember that 4 minute designed polygon around the city that we should be able to provide at 4 minutes. Where'd my cursor go? There it is. So this pink shade, that is representing that 4 minute conceptual response polygon. And you saw that based on our historical actuals, we're not able to quite reach that reliably at the 90th percentile based on industry best practice. We're at about 58%. So based on the review of our accreditation documents, tonight we covered our strategic planning process, our community-driven strategic planning process. We talked about community risk assessment standards of cover a little bit. That document has a lot more information about it in it, and I would encourage you and the community to dig into that. There's a lot of good information, and even to reference our self-assessment manual that's on our webpage. That really gets into specific programs to where you can read as it relates to key performance indicators and how we're performing and what our plan is for improvement. But at this point, I'm going to bring Chief Coffey back up, and we're going to talk about the recommendations that we received from the Commission on Fire Accreditation International as a part of our accreditation process. And I'll turn it over to Chief Coffey.
So one of the things they did, we talked about core competencies in here, and we came up with several different recommendations. I think a total of 17? 17 recommendations from the visiting site team, which we really appreciated the work. They spent 3 days with us and in numerous hours reviewing that FESM document in preparation for coming. But as they looked at core competency 2.C5, they talked about us working collaboratively with Douglas County Emergency Communications. You'll know there, when Tom was going over the information, you saw that our dispatch time was about 2.5, call processing time was about 2.5 minutes, the national standard being 1 minute. So we're working closely with Douglas County ECC to see what we can do to try to get that time down and increase our ability to have that call processing time go way down. Additionally, number 2, it said recommend the department continues ongoing efforts to add a second line operations chief officer that is included in the daily staff to manage citywide emergency responses. Tom showed you on our critical tasking, our response levels for a structure fire, and it entailed that one chief officer. As you remember, we're responsible for fire and EMS throughout the county, 475 square miles. Though it's a rarity, one of the great incidents we're always worried about is multiple structure fires. And as we all know here, about a week ago, we had 3 simultaneous structure fires and a water rescue going on at the same time. If it wasn't for the assistance of mutual aid resources coming in from Johnson County, we would have been in a fairly difficult position. But even those mutual aid resources, as they continue to come in, they're becoming less and less available to us. In fact, the last several times we had them in town, one of the things they've asked to do is to return to their communities, because the call level and demand for them is requiring them to go back. And so we've had to send them back at times before we were really able to get our crews back where they needed to be. And so it's becoming more and more difficult. Core competency 2C.5 is recommending the department continue its ongoing efforts to replace the rescue unit with 3 members to a rescue engine with 4 members. Chief Fagan talked about reliability and having that crew there to be able to do this critical tasking. If the engine is out or the ladder truck that's at Station 5, we'd have 4 members on that rescue engine. Right now, the rescue we have doesn't have any water supply on it. So no fire hose, no tanks, no ladders or anything like that. It's a rescue engine, performance or rescue. But if we added it and made it a rescue engine, then it could go out on structure fires as well. CC 2C.5 is recommended the department continue its ongoing efforts to aid a station in the northwest area of the city. Chief Fagan shows you the heat map, also the responses up in the northwest city. We do have that on our capital improvement plan for 2023. It's unfunded at this point, but as we continue to move forward, we hope that receives funding. Then we had core competency in 3D2 and core competency 9C1 is to recommend the department conduct a staffing review of the administrative division to ensure adequate staffing is available to meet the current and future demands of the department. Obviously, as we see an increase in call volume, there's a lot of ancillary work that goes with that. The administration division will be looking at developing a staffing study to see where we're at for our administration division to make sure we have adequate staffing. Core competency 5A3 is recommended the prevention division conduct an evaluation of current human power to determine if additional full-time employees are needed to effectively mitigate required duties. One of the things that we're seeing this about a 1% growth in the city annually is that our prevention division, who does all the plans reviews, the pre-occupancy inspections, are becoming quite busy like the rest of the development services. And so they'll be looking at that effort to see if there's an opportunity to be able to add staffing to help us be able to meet the timelines as required to go through. Continuing on with the core competencies, it talks about HC1 is recommended the department continue their efforts in capital planning to identify a larger training center, drill field, and additional classroom spaces. That's one we're currently working on, and we're very excited about it. This year in the capital improvement plan, we had money for a new training tower. And so as we continue to look at developing our training center, we'll look at trying to have additional enhancements there. One of the things that you guys probably notice, our fire trucks are getting bigger and bigger. And the drill field that we have is no longer large enough to be able to do our driving course on. And so we work with the airport and using an abandoned taxiway to be able to do our training there. But it'd be nice to have something in the core of the city here so we're able to respond out quicker. Core competency 8C2 is recommended that the department continue the current process of plan development to ensure consistent technical rescue education delivery. This is one of the things we're working on internally within our training division along with our technical rescue team, is just to make sure that when we do a training delivery that everybody's getting the common information and everybody's operating on the same page. Core competency 8C8 is recommended that the process utilized to evaluate training materials be formalized and documented. That's one we've currently been doing for our EMS training, and it's one that we've already put in place for our formalized training. So those are the core competencies that we looked at. We had some general recommendations as well. As recommended, the department secure all plan agreements in writing. One of the things we're working with our local partners, we have some agreements in place related to emergency operations plans, and those aren't in writing at this time, and we'll be trying to get those a little bit more formalized. 5D7 is recommended the department continue to ensure adequate management review and updating the continuity operations plan. That is that plan that we all hope that we don't have to implement. Every department in the city has a continuity of operations plan, as well as the city. Ours, we've had many changes recently within our organization and our staffing positions. And so when we review that, we needed to update some of it to meet the new positions within our organization. And then it's recommended the current program for identification and distribution of AEDs be done throughout the city of Lawrence, be expanded to Douglas County. And that's something to look at as well. We have an AED program that we monitor here within the city to try to get those distributed as close as possible, and there's a recommendation we expand that into Douglas County. And then finishing up, is recommended the department work with the Public Works Division to obtain a larger repair facility that is capable of providing sufficient space. One of the things, if you go out to our new public works shop out there, a lot of times they'll have to work on the fire trucks outside because the building's not big enough, or they'll have to move other vehicles out just to be able to get one of our trucks in there. And so as they look to develop their facilities and their capital, we want to be involved in supporting their efforts in that regard. And then it's recommended the department consider the requirement of a second set of firefighter turnout gear for these situations when the primary set is damaged, contaminated, or out of advanced cleaning. One of the big things that we're looking at in the fire service really is cancer prevention. And so we're very excited in the capital for 2019 that we actually have the money in there that you guys have set aside for us for new bunker gear. Our folks are very excited about that. And we really think that'll help us in the area of cancer prevention. As you can imagine, all the toxins that are in the gear, they're in the fire, then they come back, they have to make another call, they have to put that contaminated gear back on. This will allow us to let them move into the second set. We can move to gear extractors that we've recently been able to purchase with support from the city, as well as a ventilation system inside the stations. But those are some of the recommendations that they gave us. Sorry, one more page.
This is the last one. Last page.
So we talked about a formal leadership development plan, and that kind of goes in with succession planning. And we know all how key that is with our recent situation. We're working with our training program team, and they're going to develop a new leadership development plan that we think will carry us into the future. Also, we'll look at capturing training evaluation system to get that information back from the students when we're offering fire training. Also, that any of our agreements have a conflict resolution process that's formalized. We currently do not have that with some of our agreements, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then the last one here is recommended the department evaluate the cooperation agreement between the City of Lawrence and Douglas County for providing ambulance, hazardous materials, technical rescue, and emergency communication services. That's one that the peer team felt that we really need to look at, because we have this agreement in place and it really doesn't discuss the hazardous. It does discuss the hazardous materials, that's put out there, but we really need to look at technical rescue service as how we deliver confined space, trench rescue, high angle, extrication out in the county. The agreement doesn't really provide that. We do provide that as an extension of service, somewhat of, we do EMS and some patient care, and it goes with that. But that was a recommendation that we look more closely at that cooperation agreement. And then also with emergency communication services, an agreement we have in place there, and that also they work to help us meet that, trying to get that call time down for processing. One of the things that goes on with this is when we're working through this annually on all these, annually we have to have an annual compliance report that we submit saying where we're at on some of these projects, what actions have we taken as we're moving forward. Doesn't mean that we have to have them all done. You know, this first year is just that, are we making progress towards those? And we'll submit that in July every year to the group. So we're making progress. We really think some of these things are going well for us. When we talk about that call processing time and total response time, one of the things that we've been able to do is maximize technology. And we're using things like, we've got a preemption system, the GPS that we work with the street department to have installed on the signals. And that's made a huge difference in our response time. We all have countdown clocks in the stations now. When the alarm is dispatched, there's a clock in the bay, and it starts counting down from 1 minute, so the crews can see that in an effort to keep them going. We looked at our station layouts and how that gets to impact our turnout time. So we're trying to do many things as we can to maximize technology to help us. We have MDCs in the trucks now. We have AVL, which helps us dispatch the closest unit that'd be en route. So we're trying to do those things where we can to maximize technology, but we'll have to work closely with our communications center to try to reduce that call processing time. Anything else, Tom?
No, I think the next slide is for questions.
So with that, questions?
I have a question. On one of your recommendations dealt with the addition of eventually a 6th fire station in the northwest part of the city. You know, obviously the fire department response would be as soon as possible, but in terms of kind of a critical outlook, what is the time frame on that in terms of some of your simulated growth of the city? When does that sixth station need to be in place in order for us to maintain response times that are effective?
Well, there's areas right now in that planning zone that we're not reaching it. At the 90th percentile, we're not reaching it at the 90th percentile. So based on the growth in there, you know, obviously the sooner that would happen, we would provide more reliable service, not just there, but to the rest of the city as well. So, you know, from a planning process, we understand that there's a lot that goes along with that. But the sooner that would occur, it would provide a higher quality output, and based on those resources being in position to stop loss sooner, a higher quality outcome.
Tom Rashawn, could you pull up 10B2, please? You might suspect I'd go there. The B stands for Bradford. This is an issue, and Commissioner, when you asked the question about another station, I want to kind of give you an analogy. One of the big challenges that we faced since I've been here was the issue of affordable housing. And we talked about it and talked about it and talked about it until the idea struck us that we needed to match revenue streams to a need that stream didn't previously exist. It went to the sales tax, the voters, you know, agreed with that concept. And I think this idea of another station, this idea of more command staff, the idea of more people to respond to reduce that, this is something that Mark and I talked about all the time. And I hope he shared those ideas with the two of you as well. Because I think this one is going to be critical in terms of kind of moving us forward in the whole realm of where is this revenue coming from. So I have a question. What percentage of calls are emergency medical or rescue type calls of the total calls you have?
I don't have the hard data right here.
Give me an estimate.
Approximately 75 to 80% of our call volume.
So 75% to 80%. And what percent of the cost does the contract call for the county to pick up for medical and emergency?
About 25%.
Okay, but what is that supposed to represent in terms of the cost that they're covering? You're not following my question. Aren't they supposed to be picking up 100% of the cost?
100% of the operational
Right.
cost.
But proportionately, they're picking up 25%. So when we entered into that agreement, maybe the division, the story I've heard is the way we divided that up was to make it reflective of who was paying what at the time. Is that consistent with your understanding?
In general, yes.
Okay, so over time, if we're now 75% of the calls are now emergency or medical, does 25% reflect the true cost of providing that service any longer?
Not anymore.
Okay, so this issue's been talked about back and forth between us and the county for some time. And it causes a great deal of consternation, I think in particular for the county administration. But I think it's an issue that, you know, we really need to get into. And invoking Mark's memory, I think that is something that he and I discussed quite a bit, because that revenue could be plowed right back into this operation to do the types of things that you're asking to be done, to change, you know, how our response times look, if in fact we can expand, all of that. And it's not as if we don't pay a significant portion of the property tax from the city residents here in Lawrence, which reflects how much? 75%, I think, is the number that the city pays for county taxes as well. So while there's somewhat of a burden shift, it will still apply to the residents of this city as well. But I think that those are things that we need to have a serious conversation about. That big conversation it starts, I think, in the joint meeting with the city and the county and the town, or the school district coming up here, I think in September.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of highlight that. I think that we need to continue to work on this issue, and I'd like to see that be one of our priorities coming out of this whole process of accreditation in terms of how we address it, because we do need to increase the revenue stream to be able to do the types of things that the rest of this accreditation report talks about. And that's kind of the direction that Mark and I were going in this conversation. It isn't kind of, it was the direction we were going in. So it's going to probably cause some consternation back and forth between the city and the county, but as you recall from our budget process, we laid this whole issue out. And I think we're going to need to get into this in earnest. It has to become, I think, our priority to deal with this whole accreditation issue and the recommendations that came out of it.
I'm struggling to keep up, Tom, to be honest with you. And I guess what I'm hearing is that when these services came together, the county was going to be paying for the EMS and the city was going to be paying for the fire part. Is that the deal?
For the whole county, right?
Yeah, the county.
The county is responsible for all EMS citywide.
Right. So,
And county.
right. But I mean,
100%.
it was the county's responsible for EMS and the city's responsible for fire. Okay. And when you talked about how the number of calls was going up, I was curious about how the number of structure fires, those kinds of things, was going. If there was a separate number that tracked that, and then the separate number that tracked the other type, which is the EMS. Do you have that?
We could separate those out. We don't have those right now, but our call volume for our structure fires, obviously, as communities continue to grow and new infill development has continued to rise as well.
Yeah.
But it's a proportional thing. As you said, 75% of our calls are EMS.
But I mean, 30 years ago, what was the ratio then? I mean, because that's when this all kind of came together, right?
Yeah, and I would say to you at the time then, it was the difference would have been between what the agencies were paying at that particular time before the merger occurred, and so that was the division of cost without disrupting, people's budgets in a major way.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that agreement has been revisited in any significant way since it was adopted. Yeah. And, there's a tendency for some to maintain the status quo, and there's a tendency for others who maybe don't feel that the status quo is serving them to challenge that status
Well,
quo.
when we talk about devoting resources to these needs, I think it's really important that we take a look at how are we essentially aligning the revenue with the expenditure. Right. I think that's a key question for us.
So just I just want to make sure I understand this. The county is supposed to be paying 100% of the EMS. They're only paying 25%?
No.
It's a little tricky. Okay.
That's why I asked, because I'm not getting it.
So the concept is they're supposed to be paying 100% of the medical emergency response for that particular service, okay? But when we entered into the arrangement, the cost distribution was, I think this is how it started. The cost distribution was a certain percentage was going to fire departments, particularly Lawrence, and then a certain percentage of cost. And rather than have a ratchet built into the agreement so that we adjusted as things might have changed, whether up or down, they divided the cost at the time based on what people were paying, meaning that the two independents. The county used to provide medical, and then then we merged those two. There was a cost for providing it, okay, an actual cost that they were paying, an actual cost that we were paying. We were paying probably in the 75 plus range. They were paying in the 25% range for the medical. But what's happened, how old is that agreement? 96. Well, I can tell you that the medical calls, proportionally have gone up as a proportionate relationship, and there's been no ratchet built into the agreement to accommodate for that sort of thing. Now, you'll get a defense that, well, everybody pays the county taxes, and, so that was a relative formula at the time, but not if the costs have gone up significantly over what those were to provide that medical. And that's almost universally across the country. The proportionate increase, as I understand it, has gone up significantly in the fire service for emergency medical versus fire
I think the
response.
other elephant in the room there is when you talk about the structure of the fire department. As I understand it, and I believe it mentions this in the report, we also have an ambulance station in Baldwin and an ambulance station in Eudora. And what sort of funding do we get from the city of Eudora and the city of Baldwin?
That is another smaller elephant in the room.
Yeah.
That elephant appears to be very small, as I understand it, right? Maybe not existent in some cases.
Zero.
Well,
Different funding mechanism for the different.
I don't want to get too far astray in terms of the factual parts of this. All I'm trying to lay out at this point is that is a critical part of this recommendation, and it's been, unfortunately, I think, in avoidance to some degree. We've steered clear of it, but I don't think you can steer clear of it if you're going to meet the expectation. Now, the other thing I'd point out to you is, pull up the slide that shows the response time expectations between a rural and urban area.
I didn't include rural information in here.
Yeah, you had a 12-minute
Yeah.
standard and
there
a
you
6,
go. Yep.
if I recall correctly. So does that show that?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
so the benchmark is 6 minutes in an urban area, 12 minutes. So let me just proffer the question. You're suggesting here that it takes you 12 minutes out of the station. So you've got a commitment for 12 minutes on an average, or a benchmark for a county response from an urban station versus 6 minutes in town. So your cost commitment on that alone is a significant difference as well. It's twice as long time out of service. And we don't, so when you have multiple simultaneous calls, that has an impact on what we do in terms of supporting the urban environment.
What sort of rural response are we dealing with there? If you're dealing with a fire that's outside of city limits, typically this is often dispatched to like a Wakarusa Fire Department, correct? Are you responding as well?
For fires, we're city only. For EMS out in the county.
Okay, so that's referring specifically just to EMS.
Yes.
Who pays for the county, the ones out in the county, the fire departments?
The fire departments, the townships.
The townships, too.
Some of them are townships and some are fire district. I believe there's 3 fire districts within the county now, and the rest are organized on township.
Okay.
And their jurisdictions pay for those.
I guess I'd like to go back to that agreement for just a minute and ask whether the practices have changed since 1996. Did you used to deploy a fire engine to an EMS call in 1996?
Yes, initially, yes, we've always done that.
Okay, but when the county was doing the EMS, would you also show it?
It's kind of interesting. I have to go back to '96, and even as old as I look, at that point, I was just a barely maybe lieutenant, just a very senior firefighter. But
Yeah.
when we merged with the ambulance service, we went from providing no EMS care to becoming the ALS agency within
Right.
the county
Yeah.
and the city. And so that was a big change for us.
Right.
And at that time, we'd see an ambulance go by and a fire truck wouldn't go. Well, that wasn't good delivery service to our community. We
Yeah.
merged, which was a good thing for everybody
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
But that's when we started sending, depending upon the level of EMS call, a type 1 type EMS
Yeah.
call, cardiac, we send a fire truck and an ambulance.
But I'm an accountant, so what I'm looking at is if the financing structure was built on the previous structure, where only the ambulance went and the fire truck didn't, then that might not be in that 25% that we're looking to the county for.
At some
So-
point, there were only 22 ambulances, I think, working in the county at different times
Yeah.
now, where we're
Yeah.
looking at 5 full-time
Yeah.
and a fire truck. Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
And to be clear on the urban planning zones, both the city of Eudora and Baldwin City, based on their population density, those zones are urban within their city limits.
right.
The planning zones outside of those do not meet the population density requirements and then thus would constitute a rural planning zone
Yeah.
benchmark.
Right. Okay. Any other questions?
So a couple years ago, I had an article that I gave to a couple firefighters. I didn't know who to give it to at the time, but I was really interested in the usage of iPads when you go on EMS calls. And there's people, of course, that don't have insurance that perhaps either they might let their issue get bad enough that they have to call an ambulance and have to go to the emergency room, but some people call, you know, in EMS just for care, I guess you might say. So some communities have started using iPads to connect that patient with a doctor through the use of iPads when they go out on these calls. Has there been any idea of looking at using that?
Not that specific format, but one of the things that we are looking at is what some people will call the community paramedicine program. And we're just kind of in tentative discussions with Lawrence Memorial Hospital as it relates to that. There have been communities that have adopted that program and have seen some efficiencies from that, where we go to there are several people, clients, patients, that maybe we might run 10 times in 2 days. And sometimes we can maybe get some intervention in to help them with that issue and direct them to an area where they can get that help. And so there are avenues we're investigating, but that specific one we haven't looked at so far.
Yeah, I think that might be really helpful to have ambulances not tied down to at least so many calls or for such a long period of time, especially if they have to take someone to the emergency room.
Absolutely.
Commissioner Soden, the point you make is a very important one when it comes to mitigation of risk, and that being risk as it relates to probability, consequence, and impact to our ability to further protect our community. But these low-risk events still tie up resources, emergency resources. And so as we move into the future, sure, we need to be looking at our outcomes, our output measurement, but we need to be attacking it from a risk reduction standpoint and a public health standpoint. We need to be looking at it from both sides for all risk and all hazards. And that's something that we're digging more into right now with one of our recent new hires with a background in epidemiology. We're wanting to gather more information together. How can we work with our community to really look at both sides of it, not just from the deployment standpoint. We're always going to need to make sure that we have that capability and capacity for surges in the system. But we need to be looking at it from the prevention and risk reduction as well. And so we are investigating those things and bringing in bigger data elements to try to make some good informed decisions to steer us down that road to where we can make that impact.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the mental health team, of course, has done a good job at collaborating between different resources, especially with HIPAA restrictions. If there's some way that perhaps EMS can join those collaborative efforts, that would be really good. You know, maybe in the future, if someone's in crisis, then you all end up taking them to the crisis stabilization center instead of the emergency room. Another question that I had to do, you were talking about training facilities, and of course I couldn't help think at the time that we have so many education outlets in Douglas County. If there's a way for us to use, you know, facilities like the Peasley Center or something like that for training. Have you looked into that kind of thing?
We looked at that. Actually, we used the Peasley Center before it was the Peasley Center for training. One of the things that happens...
Not for fires, though.
But, yeah.
Just for classroom.
One of the things we do is in our classroom facility, we have some, as you can imagine, for our simulations, we have a high-fidelity mannequin also that we don't like to move around a lot. And so it takes quite a bit of equipment to do and move around. And so we try to keep that in our training center because say you run an EMS simulation, you've seen the amount of equipment we take in with us and stuff. So it just doesn't really transition good to being real portable. We've done it at times, but we have had good partnerships and we have used those facilities for fire training that also involves EMS training as well.
Excellent. I was also curious, at 31st Louisiana, of course, we have, I think it's the Wakarusa Township Fire Station. I don't know their official full name, At what point does the city kind of take over a fire station? I couldn't help but notice a lot of those calls run South Iowa. And of course, they might even be closer than the one that's by the Army Reserve Center at 19th, 21st in Iowa.
Well, currently, Wakarusa Station is within the city, actually, but their response boundary, they cover the southern edge of the county, just next to the city, and they also are just north of town up by the KPNL power plant, and north of that area by Lakeview.
Right.
So that's their response district, and so they cover those jurisdictional areas. We do have a good working relationship with Wakarusa, and when we've had some of these major events where we needed resource, we have a good partnership. We've been able to call them in and actually have them come in and staff our station and run some calls for us when we run out.
Yeah, I was curious, since they might be closer to 31st in Iowa, if that's something that we start including somehow in response times. Of course, the way I say it, it sounds simple, but I know in terms of your data and operations, that's not so simple.
I was going to speak to that, and you hit it right on the head. As Chief Coffey was mentioning, they're a tremendous resource when we get drawn down. Based on their staffing, they don't have any minimum staffing requirements. And so based on that context, when we talk about critical task analysis and deploying that resource as a first arriving unit, what they would be able to be providing would be limited by the resources that are on that unit.
Are they volunteers?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so they are a tremendous resource, and,
Yeah.
and we're very thankful to have them nearby. But that's something we have to keep in mind when
Yeah.
we're relying on them to provide that.
Interesting.
Not sure what their staffing is that day.
So we talk about that critical tasking and the number of people, the 16 people that
Yeah.
they showed up the other day when we had those 3 fires, and we're very grateful for their help. But when they showed up with one person on a fire truck. So the person that was working as the incident commander looked and was like, okay, I got one person that can pump the truck, but no other fire resources. Luckily, we had some medic units because all of our personnel cross-trained both directions. The medic unit came in. We didn't have a fire suppression apparatus. Wakarusa was there to provide that, but they didn't have the people to be able to staff it, so we had to pull people from medic units to be able to make that fire attack. So a lot of those critical tasks that we've identified weren't being met by not having that
Right.
staffing level.
My last question was actually to the city manager. I couldn't help notice, that this accreditation is just awesome, I guess you might say, in terms of the data and planning that comes out of it. Do we have anything similar that we do with the police department?
No, the only thing I would say that we've done similar more recently is that evaluation of the staffing levels that gets into the metric kind of driven approach. There is an accreditation process that I think police departments can go through as well. Heretofore, they haven't chosen to go down that path. More recently, the recommendations for them to consider doing some strategic planning of their own would be a good start as well. And this process, accreditation might come out of that as well. These are big time commitments and resource commitments. So understand that that's always part of the issue. And I think that in their case, they probably have deployed manpower expense as a priority versus going down this process, because how many people do you have dedicated to the accreditation process?
Well, we like to believe everybody's involved in it.
But how many have you got dedicated in terms of day-to-day responsibility? One person?
Accreditation manager, along with his other administrative duties, and each one of the chiefs, when we talked about the different areas within the FESM, we all have a responsible area that we're to cover along with our additional duties we do. So it's fairly labor intensive, but we think it's well worth it.
You have to consider all that
Yeah.
in the process.
It's something I'd be interested in doing, for the police department, because of course, one of the things that you can't help noticing is that on the first, actually it's the third slide, but the first real slide is the top 5 community expectations. I think that's a really good foundation to start from.
Well, I would tell you that that the department is implementing 3 of the more critical elements of community, I think, engagement and probably items that the community would be very supportive of, and those are the CPRB, Community Police Review Board. We're currently studying the agreement, trying to get it refined into something that is enforceable in terms of disproportionate minority contact. And the third is the body camera initiative. So they are, despite not having an accreditation, not being in an accreditation process, they are clearly being responsive, I think, to the community in terms of those types of initiatives that we are really pushing forward on. And quite frankly, that is a huge financial commitment and employee commitment to make all that work. Just the changes, the counts for the DMC that will be required by an officer, the body camera, implementing that policy, and then having the employees follow those policies. There's a lot of administrative work there, but in the long run, that's something that they probably should consider. I'd like to see them first move into a strategic plan process. So.
Is that something that already had funding for 2019?
What's that?
Is strategic planning?
No. With the new chief, I think it was appropriate to give the chief a chance to kind of experience the department, understand what's going on, and then have that conversation and see if that's something that they're ready to start. So probably next budget.
Well, real quick comment as we transition talking about the community expectation. I did just want to make a quick comment on. As I looked at the accreditation report, I think it was 5B, criterion 5B, which talked about public education. I happen to live about 100 yards away from a fire station, and so I'm well aware of how busy you are. That's the soundtrack of my house most all the time. And but I think in the public education department, you've done a really nice job with smoke detector events. I know you just had one not too long ago. All the way down to stuff with handing my daughter her bike helmet. I mean, it just all the way through that public education piece. I think you do a fantastic job, and I just wanted to chime in and tell you that. And I hope that that's something that you continue to value as a department. So.
Don't people know where your house is? Maybe they're hitting the siren a little extra.
Well, you run a lot of calls right there. Is all I know.
I've got one question about the date.
On the map that had all the dots on it for travel time, or
This one?
yeah, that
Okay,
one.
yes.
The orange dots, you had indicated that even though some of them were near fire stations, that it might be a situation where you had to pull equipment from another station. Is that? Do you have any data? Can you drill down into that data to see what percentage of those was for that reason?
Well, we could dig into that. Some of that explanation gets into the reliability by the planning zones. So, for example, we do have the chart or the table for Planning Zone 1. Just looking at Planning Zone 1 here, you can see this is one, as I was speaking to earlier, this is one of our higher demand, not just for structure fires, but all risk. Let's see if I can go to the table. There we go. So Planning Zone 1. What's interesting about Planning Zone 1 is the number of events that occur there. But also, there is different design in the roadway infrastructure of this area of the community and how that influences travel time. The grid-style roadways do appear to make a difference on travel time. I think the positioning of the station is also one that constitutes good travel time throughout the planning zone as well. But, again, if that resource is not available, then we're having to go to the next closest resource that is, and if that one is not, then the next closest one that is. And so we can dig more into that.
I think it'd be interesting to see if that's the case. I think that also kind of supports the idea that we need additional services.
I'd like to add to your point there, looking at call density and infill, unit reliability as we look at distribution of resources. And going from a lean concept, we definitely understand that. But there are areas in our community, if that reliability of that resource is starting to reach that threshold where they're not able, they may be in a great location, but if they're not available enough to provide that quality response time we may need to look into some resiliency within that response area, perhaps another fire company within that fire station to provide that depth for the demand on calls within that planning zone. And so right now, one of the recommendations in Planning Zone 5 is to look at the rescue, bolster the staffing to get it equivalent with our fire apparatus, and then to change the design of that apparatus to also function as an engine in addition to a rescue. What that would allow us to do is to give us another player on the court. They would be able to provide the same type of response that the other fire apparatus within the city would be able to provide as well within the core of the city for distribution throughout all areas. So it would be a service level increase in the service level provision by increasing the number of players on the courts. That would address some of the reliability challenges throughout the entire city, but not necessarily concentrated, for example, in Planning Zone 1, but more in the core of the city for all of the planning zones.
Thank you.
So I had the privilege of touring the fire department as I was going through all of my tours, and I received a copy of both the cover and the strategic plan. And it was my understanding that given the wealth of data in there, that's all put into an Excel spreadsheet and not a database. So that is highly commendable to be able to manage that much data in, a word processing or spreadsheet processing program. So kudos.
When they talked about that and the time involved, that was many, many hours to manage that data. Now with our new Mickey Wu here, our epidemiologist, we're excited about her work and the ability she can work with multiple databases. And so we're looking at moving beyond Excel into some additional databases that maybe give us more functionality and provide even more information and detail for us.
Yeah, that's terrific, because I was blown away by the fact that this is all on an Excel spreadsheet and put together, by hand, essentially. So I did have a couple of questions in addition to my kudos. The thing that I noticed time-wise that is kind of outside of the influence of the elements or basketball games or the shape of the road, et cetera, is the alarm handling time. Is that something that you feel can be effectively addressed, or you've identified at least the hurdles to reducing that?
We've worked closely with Douglas County ECC to try to address that problem. And they're working through some issues within their own organization. They've had some turnover issues, training time issues, length of service by some of their personnel. And so they're working through that, trying to enhance those. We believe that time can come down, and we're going to encourage them to continue to work on that, and we're looking at all options we can related to that.
Sure. Okay. When talking about a 40% increase of call volume, I think we talked about that a little bit in wanting, to see a little bit more data about what that looks like. But I think that, looking at the recommendations and taking that kind of a step further, looking at prevention work was one of the recommendations. And so what is the impact that prevention can potentially have, and maybe looking into what that could look like, particularly if you have more data that you could focus into specific areas where you are getting specific calls. Is that something that might be effective?
Absolutely. We need to dig into that information more, and that is our plan to do so. We're working on some software to assist with that, a software system that can incorporate much larger data sets than what Excel is able to manage. I mean, we're talking, instead of thousands of records, even up to 1 million or millions of records, socioeconomic information, demographic information, bringing in information from our electronic patient care records to where we can really identify trends that are going on in our community, and then engage some of the concepts that Commissioner Soden spoke to earlier on, the community paramedic type of option in the future, to where we can get out in front of that from a public health standpoint, to where we aren't having to utilize emergency resources for lower risk incident types, because when those units are tied up, we are committed to that person to address their need, and then that unit isn't available. So we talk about capacity and limitations. That is risk within itself. I think the question as we move into the future and we start to get more and more information, again, comes back to funding context. That whole new service level, and how is that paid for and how we move down that road. But I think we're really close to getting some good information to get some countermeasures, so to speak, to minimize that risk.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that you didn't speak to was inspections that you all do, but it's my understanding that that is heavy, a heavy load that you have that isn't necessarily always, where it needs to be at the time that it needs to be. Do you feel like that would influence?
Any of our prevention work we can do is going to make a huge difference on the front end, obviously on the back end. And so our prevention program, one of the things we do becomes more and more difficult is a lot of our business inspections, or occupancy inspections we call them, are conducted by our companies in the stations. So the crew at Station 1 in the afternoon, they'll go around different occupancies and do those. Also within the living units, the apartments and stuff, they'll do those as well. What we're finding is becoming more and more difficult because as you can see the demand's increasing more and more for service. Less effort's being put into that prevention side, even though we're attempting to do it. But we may not get as many done as we can. If you don't get those done, then obviously you're not taking care of on the front end, then you have a problem on the back end.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see, effective impact in other communities, what that's looked like, and where that investment might be most wisely. Obviously in all of those places, but how that might kind of pull back on the stress that you're feeling as far as, response times and the number of responses that you're doing.
Yeah, anything you can do up front, use that on the backside.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's where we use technology, though, as we talked a little bit about. One of the things, the integration of all that data from our patient reports to our inspections we do, a lot of that's all being used with what I call technology. I'm not a computer guy, but iPads and iBooks and different things, and so we can integrate all that data together to get a good picture.
Great, thanks.
I can speak from experience about their inspection program. When I had my business, they were out there at least once a year, and they were very, very thorough about what they did, and also the follow-up was good. If you had a violation, they made sure that you followed through. I thought it was a really good program.
I've been around long enough to know how that was before we had that in the town. And as I was growing up here and stuff, before we had the inspection program, it was not unusual to have a large downtown fire, at least annually. And Chief Jim McSwain was the fire chief that came in and implemented that program. And obviously it was met with somewhat reservation. But it was really instrumental on that prevention side you talked about to decrease those numbers of fires. And knock on wood, we've been lucky that we haven't.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
I've got one more question. Your response times benchmark that you use, where did those come from?
They come from NFPA standards.
Okay.
NFPA 1710 speaks to travel time, turnout time, and effective response force. 1221 speaks to the alarm handling standards.
Okay. Thank you.
I imagine those are being altered because of the materials inside of a home being much more flammable, and or at least reaching a higher temperature more quickly, right?
Yeah, and we compare it to what we call legacy construction, the modern construction and furnishings as well. When I grew up, a lot of stuff was cotton, wool, that type of thing. Now everything in your home is made out of petroleum products and plastics. They burn so much hotter and faster. And back to that response time, getting there is so critical, because if we can intercept it early in its growth curve, then we're able to make a big impact.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, that chart where we were showing the outcomes on flame spread, that ties in directly with that.
Yeah.
So if time being correlated with the outcome and the growth of the fire, some of those elements as it's associated with that are controllable, but a lot of them are not. Things like flow path, construction materials, construction design of the building, obviously suppression systems, fire detection systems, all of those things influence it as well. But if the sooner we can get there, the more we can incorporate our tactics and strategy to mitigate the risk and the hazard to prevent the loss.
Thank you very much. I think that gets our questions. Appreciate that. We'll have public comment.
I'm Katie Welsh. I just need a little reassurance. There have been a couple of fires recently in Kansas City where they went to the hydrants and there was no water. And the media blamed it on the drought and infrastructure problems. So my question is, do we routinely test our hydrants? Thank you.
I think we can respond to that.
If I heard right, I apologize. Do we annually test our fire hydrants? And yes, we will have an agreement with the utility department. That's part of the ISO program. It's also part of our program where not every hydrant is inspected every year, but it's about a 3-year rotational plan. The utility department conducts those tests for us. They don't only test them operationally to make sure they work, but they also test them for flow, for GPM. So over time, if we have an area where we have low hydrant pressure or gallons per minute, we can work with the utility department. They're great support in this effort to make sure we got the proper flow levels for fire flow.
Thank you. Other public comment? Okay. I think we can take about a 5-minute break. Be back in 5 minutes, please.
I am too now. I'll just do my comments like this.
Yeah, thank you.
Kurt
Okay.
loves when you do that.
Do what?
He said Kurt loves when you move around.
We are back.
Ready. Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners. Casey Toomey, Assistant City Manager. Tonight, our second work session item is priority-based budgeting. As you all recall, one of your priority initiatives is to develop a plan to implement priority-based budgeting and enhance communication in the annual budget process. We visited with you back in March a little bit about priority-based budgeting, and at that time, we committed to meeting with the Center for Priority-Based Budgeting and strategizing a reasonable time frame and implementation plan with the hopes of having the system in place for building the 2020 budget. So earlier tonight, we wrapped up our 2019 budget, and thank you all for that, and thanks to the departments and staff for working on that. So no time like the present to start talking about 2020. We have had some preliminary discussions with Chris Fabian, who's here tonight from the Center for Priority-Based Budgeting, and he's going to give you a little bit of an overview tonight and give you an opportunity to ask some questions. We're also working with the Center for Priority-Based Budgeting on a draft agreement that we'll bring back before all of you that will get signed if it's appropriate with you all, to get that process in place, and we'll get our work officially underway. Unless you have questions for me, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Casey. Questions for Casey? Nope. Hey,
Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks to you, Mayor, and the Commission, and thanks to you, Tom, and Casey, and Brian, and staff for having me here. My name is Chris Fabian. I'm the founder of the Center for Priority-Based Budgeting, and then I founded ResourceX, which is our technology company, and then we brought the companies together last year in 2007. If you've heard of both, I didn't mean to cause any confusion. We are spread out across the country. In fact, just last week, we had our annual Priority-Based Budgeting User Summit. It was in Denver, Colorado. That's where we met Casey last year. And it was a great event. We're now at over 200 implementations of priority-based budgeting across the United States and into Canada. I've met several of you through the National League of Cities, ICMA, the International City and County Management Association, and the Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA. If you haven't heard enough acronyms tonight, I had a few more for you. I'm here tonight, as Casey described, to talk to you a little bit about priority-based budgeting. I promise I'll keep it somewhat short and sweet. I really would like to tell you what communities are doing with this practice these days, and hopefully open up the floor to some question and some discussion about how it could work here in Lawrence. The spirit of our conference last week, now having implemented in over 200 organizations, was where communities are going next with PBB and how they're taking action on the data. Listening to the presentation right before mine, if I had to do this all over again, I would have called my presentation 10B2 instead of PBB. And the reason is because so much of our work actually involves how to tackle those types of discussions for regional partnerships, for the cost of services that you provide, how do you generate revenue from your partners, how can you regionalize services. That is one of the action areas, but one of the action areas that has become really important to the priority-based budgeting community. If you think about it, as you see this slide, and this was the spirit of our conference, the purpose of priority-based budgeting is to help a city like Lawrence or any sort of community figure out how they're going to provide the resources for the future that they want to build. It's as simple as that. When we created PBB in the beginning, it was back during the Great Recession when it certainly felt like we did not have enough resources to fund the needs that our communities have. And while balancing the budget using traditional measures was certainly one option, we needed a different set of tools. And so today's PBB communities, as you see on the left-hand side, they have new needs, no different than what your fire department just expressed. Needs for new programs that you wish to start, needs for enhancing current services, and the question is, how are you going to do that? So PBB aims to try to solve that problem overall. So if priority-based budgeting is basically a tool, a means to an end, we try to point you to your two levers. Your levers include somehow bringing more money into this organization, so we work on the revenue side, and we work on the expense side as well. So with all the resources that you do bring in, how can you optimize those resources? How might you reconsider the resources that you have in order to reallocate them towards the new priorities of the day? Ultimately, we point to a whole host of opportunity areas, and I won't go into all of these tonight. This was the spirit of the conference, but the PBB blueprint suggests that if you have opportunities to free up and reallocate resources, so working on the expense side of the equation, we try to help you with certain things like looking at your other partners, leveraging perhaps other public sector partners, other nonprofits, the school district, the hospital, even in the private sector, to reconsider sourcing, to free up money and redirect those resources towards the new programs you want to get into. We look at efficiencies. The fire department was talking specifically about technology solutions. So how do you apply efficiency solutions in order to free up resources and redirect them towards the new programs you wish to start? And ultimately, we look at service levels on the expense side. On the revenue side, essentially, and this is where I was getting really excited, we look at fees for service and charges for service, and are they commensurate with the cost of providing those services? So 10B2, obviously, having much to do with what does it cost you to provide services, and is it fair, the revenue that's coming back into the organization for what you provide? We look at the other side of the sourcing equation, which is insourcing. As you talked about working with Baldwin City and Eudora, many of our communities, whether it's fire, whether it's recreation services or maintenance or fleet, they look for the partners in their region who might be able to pay you for the benefit of them offloading some of their services and you becoming a regional service provider for an appropriate price tag. And ultimately, as you see in the bottom right area, some PBB communities use their work to frame a taxation discussion. We say it's a last resort, and the purpose of PBB is to look for every other opportunity first, but ultimately it may come to the point where you ask citizens for more. So we help frame that discussion around the priorities that you have. Just a couple of snapshots that were exciting from last week. At this point, we have over 125,000 services that have been evaluated across all of our communities. So think of the services that you provide here, 125,000 services across the PBB community and something like $34 billion in program expenses. One of the areas on that blueprint I just showed you on the revenue side of the equation is taking a look at the cost for providing those services and the revenues coming in. And of the communities we've worked in, one thing that's pretty exciting on that fees for service opportunity area is recognizing that for those communities who go through PBB, they find that they have roughly 16% of their revenues on the table when it comes to fees not collected for services. So that becomes really interesting. So these are programs where you already charge a fee, the fee is less than the cost of providing the service, and it amounts to, on average, 16% of a potential revenue increase, untapped revenues across the PBB community. So this being just one opportunity area, this is something that we try to point you to, and this is something that you can anticipate at the end of all of your work is where will you fall? Will it be 16%? Will all of those revenue opportunities be something that you want to dive into? You see Shawnee, Kansas, I'll be there tomorrow. They're right at that 16% mark. Goodyear, Arizona, about 9%. I don't think I have any other Kansas or Missouri communities on this particular side. Oh, there's Joplin down the line at about 11% overall. So just to be illustrative, this is what you can anticipate, and it's one of the reasons that you get into all this work. When it comes to leveraging partnerships, this was another opportunity area in that blueprint. What I'm demonstrating here, we analyzed everybody we've worked with thus far, and when it comes to looking at your potential partners in the community, a finding from our work is that 41% on average for the communities we work with of the budget dollars go to programs that are uniquely unto you as a service provider, that are your responsibility as a local government. They're high priority and nobody else is around to provide them. Whereas roughly 59% on average for the communities we work with represents budget dollars tied to programs where there are potential partners. And so that becomes really interesting, right? Is if over half of your budget represents programs where partnerships could occur, just like your fire department is talking about partnerships with Douglas County, Eudora, Baldwin City, we try to point you in that direction to say, are those partnerships worth considering? So this is the kind of stuff that we get into, and this is what you can expect as you finish your PBB work, is to be able to have this type of program data overall. Well, I thought what I would like to do for the rest of my presentation is demonstrate just what these communities are doing in priority-based budgeting. I call it the 4 levels of priority-based budgeting mastery because the practice has truly evolved since we first began. Level 1, which I'll start with, when we first started to launch priority-based budgeting, the whole idea was we needed some way to talk about the resources we have, the results we're trying to achieve, and whether or not those resources are aligned with those results or not. And since then, it has evolved substantially to what do you do about the results that you get? How do you begin to reallocate the resources that you have? So level 1, truly, this is why most communities got into PBB in the first place. We needed some sort of a rational tool to build on our line item budget and truly answer the question, are our scarce resources aligned with the results we're trying to accomplish? If so, great. Where do we have opportunities to reallocate the resources that we have? I can't expect you to read this slide, so please let me just give you that disclaimer right now. But this is Boise, Idaho, and where they start is similar to the framed set of results that you have on your wall. Many of our communities begin with some understanding of where they're trying to go, the results that they're trying to accomplish. Here in Boise, a safe and secure community, a responsible built environment, a connected community, a healthy community with a strong and diverse local economy. The part that you can't read, those are specific result definitions. So we help to define each and every result so that it's clear what you mean in Lawrence by a safe and secure community versus what Boise means versus what Shawnee means. Those result definitions become your specific definitions for what it takes to achieve those results. And in PBB, in level 1, the whole idea is that every dollar is tied to a program. Those programs are scored against these results, and you can ascertain where your budget goes, this being Boise's, in terms of the result areas that are receiving the largest amount of investment. And for you as elected officials, for department heads, for citizens, this becomes really interesting to simply ask, is this where you want to be? If you look at these result areas and you say, I think we need to bolster our investment in any one result or another, the question becomes back to that blueprint. Where are you going to find the resources to do that? Are you going to generate new revenue? Are you going to free up resources that you have to push towards those result areas? Well, we thought this would be, before I go on to level 2, as we looked very simply at your website, and I know Casey and Tom from some of your work with Julia Novak and the strategic planning efforts that are going on, we partner really often and frequently with Novak Consulting. As you look at the results that matter most to this community towards the future, the question mark will be, where do your resources go for these particular results? That will be one of the outcomes of your work. Well, as we first rolled out PBB to the first handful of implementers, that was the end goal. It was a report card, more or less, to say, do your results, are they receiving the level of investment that you want? But then communities started to take action on that and say, well, how do we change our current picture? And if we need to push resources in a particular direction, how might we do that? And so level 2 communities have started to demonstrate or prove that resource reallocation from within really does work. So here's a basic example. Just like you, City of Branson, Missouri, also has a set of results and definitions that they have spent time, the full range and gamut of all that they're hoping to achieve. Again, sorry, my apologies that you can't read that, but from safety to economy to mobility and infrastructure to quality of life, parks and recreation, tourism and transportation, and an internal good governance result. They too took every dollar in the budget, allocated them to programs, scored those programs to results. But the net outcome is a prioritization of those programs. And what you're looking at here is another key visualization of PBB. So every program gets scored against these results overall, and the programs that demonstrate the greatest degree of influence are deemed your highest priority or most relevant programs overall. We call them quartile 1 or quartile 2 programs in our methodology, as differentiated from quartile 3 or quartile 4 programs, which have relatively less influence on the results. So what you're seeing here in Branson's case is every dollar in their budget as they've been allocated to programs, and those programs are scored and ranked. Well, what happens over time is that if this was your first picture, as it is in Branson, your spending array, the question becomes, how might we pull back a little bit on Q3 and Q4 in order to push those resources towards quartile 1 and quartile 2? That becomes the mark of success. And as you see here in Branson, this is exactly what they've been able to do. So these level 2 communities start to get better and better at questioning the investment in programs that have less to do with results and taking resources out, meaning reassigning staff or cutting back on programs, or remember in the blueprint, efficiencies, applying technology to reduce a particular cost, or finding a partner in the community, reducing costs of quartile 4 and quartile 3, freeing up those resources and pushing them towards quartile 1 and quartile 2. That's what you see here in the graph. This is a time lapse from 2015. You can see in quartile 4, they're shrinking by a little bit over $1 million, quartile 3 by a little bit over $1 million, and pushing those resources towards quartile 1 and quartile 2. So we thought this was pretty cool. Level 2 communities start to get good at the resource reallocation game. And the next question becomes, how far should you take this? What is the true outcome that you're seeking? And at the conference, City of Kalamazoo, Michigan, was one of several who actually went down this path quite far. Their city manager and their mayor have said, well, we get PBB. It's this nice, simple tool to take resources out of some areas and push them towards others. And it begs the question to you all, what are you really trying to achieve? And in Kalamazoo, on the left-hand side, what you see there, one of their new outcomes for their community is to try to end generational poverty. Their goal is that the next generation of citizens who are born into Kalamazoo, nobody will ever be born into poverty again. Will they achieve it? It's highly controversial, but at least they have aspirational goals. This is what they're trying to do, and they realize through priority-based budgeting, they can free up resources and push them towards those results overall. They've actually become so good at this that they dreamed really big and engaged their private sector locally. If you've read about what's going on in Kalamazoo, they've actually generated on the revenue side a massive donation from some philanthropic interests in Kalamazoo to also help them towards this net end goal. In Scott County, Minnesota, they're in the middle. They're focused on trying to reallocate resources to start new programs, just like you saw in the blueprint, to try to end homelessness. But whether you're ending poverty, ending homelessness, or over on the right-hand side, all the way down to fixing potholes, we were working in Littleton, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver, and one of their city council members said, ending poverty is great, ending homelessness, nobody can complain about that, but we have pothole issues that we need to fix there. So the whole point here is that PBB is a tool for whatever goals you're trying to reach, the new programs you wish to start, the high priority programs you wish to enhance. Where are you going to find the money? We're going to free up resources and redirect them towards those goals that you have overall. So again, as I see your priority initiatives, these being but a sampling, it gets me excited to think you are already thinking about the future. Our goal is to try to help you with a tool to free up resources or to generate new revenue in order to push that future that you're hoping to create. And finally, if level 3 isn't enough, we do have a handful of pretty crazy communities. They spoke at the conference as well. But if you think about it, you can free up and reallocate all you want within this city's budget. And there will come a time where you can't do any more. You only have so many resources here within City Hall. And so the level 4 communities have realized that if we can look beyond our own city and look out towards the region, and try to understand how we might begin to optimize across all of the potential partners that we have who might share interest in the goals that you have as a city. Can we align those resources overall? Maybe we can tap into something that's much bigger than just the city's budget. And that's exactly what's happening. In Washington County, Wisconsin, they started an initiative called Counties Without Borders. And the whole idea is Washington County has implemented PBB. They took their program inventory data and they reached out to their 4 neighboring counties and they said, here are the services we provide. Do you provide similar services? Are there opportunities worth considering for merger or consolidation? One of their biggest examples, just because it's easy to understand, they merged health departments with one neighboring county. Each health department provides a whole host of services in our vernacular, but as the 2 health departments came together, you bet that they found redundant positions, redundant programs, and overlap. They eliminated the redundancy without eliminating positions. So you end up with a freed up workforce, right? And they took the people, the human resources, and reallocated them to new programs that neither one of the entities was able to start on their own. That's the whole point. If you have a merger, you free up resources to redirect towards new programs that you wish to start. City of Toledo took this one step further, and they worked specifically with their Chamber of Commerce. Chamber of Commerce in the City of Toledo representing small businesses in Toledo, well, all businesses who are members actually, and the city is working with the Chamber to try to find programs that are appropriate, not your traditional privatization exercise, but to find programs where, like street sweeping or leaf collection or ice rink maintenance, they might be able to depend on the private sector. If they can outsource certain programs, they free up their own resources to redirect towards programs that they wish to start in Toledo. Part of my purpose here tomorrow is indeed pancakes. I'm going to be in Shawnee, Kansas, where they too are reaching out not only to their chamber, but Johnson County is going to be there, their neighboring cities, a whole host of nonprofits. Shawnee's belief is that they have a plethora of nonprofit organizations, and they don't know exactly what programs that they provide. And so the city of Shawnee is open to finding out where they have programs that match up so that they might be able to insource and maybe provide regional fleet to some of those entities overall. The school district's coming, a local hospital as well. And they're also looking for opportunities where they might be able to outsource, just like Toledo did. And so finally, as I wrap up, you consider your own future and the 4 levels, and whether you're talking about the fire department needs that were just discussed, whether it's mobility, safe communities. Many of our organizations are trying to produce a responsible resource allocation towards opioids. Some of us are planning for an autonomous future and trying to find resources to do that, or providing for inclusive economies. The whole the pitch of priority-based budgeting, the allure these days, is that for whatever future you're trying to resource, whatever future you're trying to create, new programs, program enhancements, PBB is a tool to free up resources and redirect towards those results that you're trying to accomplish. So with that in mind, the very beginning of your process looks like this. It's the identification of programs. So what programs do you provide? The cost allocation of your line item budget towards those programs. So what does every program cost you to provide? Part and parcel with that is a revenue allocation. That's how we'll come to understand for those programs that charge a fee, are the fees covering what it truly costs you to provide those programs, a la 10B2. Those programs are scored relative to your results, and you too will have a spending array, quartile 1, 2, 3, and 4, should you decide to go down the path of priority-based budgeting. I think I'll stop there for a second to see how this is coming across and if there's any questions that I can help address.
Questions? Or
I've got one.
Chris.
You were talking about one thing that the PBB does is it looks at all the fee structures and the fees that are being charged in the city now. Is that a detailed, in-depth look at each department, or is that more of just an overview of the city as a whole?
For every service that's identified, if the service draws a revenue, those revenues will be allocated to the program as well.
Okay.
So the distinction that I would make, which I think you might be going for, is, for instance, if we looked in the utilities, PBB won't go so deeply as to say, how is your tiered rate structure designed, and is it appropriate based on commercial users versus residential and volume of use? It won't get that granular, but you will come to understand for any program, whether it's building inspections, residential tree removal, Parks and Rec basketball, any program where a fee is coming in, there's a net calculation. Are the revenues equal to the expense? Are they less? Are they in excess? That sometimes happens as well. That's the level of fee
So it
study.
will kind of dive in even to our Parks and Recs. I mean, they have hundreds of programs,
Yep.
and it will dive into that.
Does it necessarily then operate from the assumption that all programs that collect a fee should be capable of self-financing?
It becomes a policy question. Yeah. So for any program where there's at least capacity, meaning the revenue is short of the total cost of providing the program, it comes back to departments and to you to say, is it appropriate? It very well might be the case. It's totally inappropriate, that you're intentionally subsidizing a program, and that's a wise thing to do. But at least it's on the table to say, are we sure we know why There might be state statutory limitations on fees.
And that was where I guess I sort of raised an eyebrow with that, was that it seemed like this would be data that we would make publicly available, I would assume, right? And my fear with that is then there's a lot of things we intentionally subsidize because they're things we find to be important within our community and don't necessarily generate a profit, right? We're not generating a profit on late fees at the public library, for instance, but we operate, we operate those things at a deficit somewhat intentionally. And my fear would be that as that data comes out, that it may, in the public, may almost vilify those things as, you and I had this conversation about the golf course, for instance, that, let's not pick on individual things when truthfully we subsidize so many things. So how have you found cities have dealt with that, avoiding vilifying one thing that is necessarily heavily subsidized versus something like water utility that makes a profit for the community?
It's a fantastic conversation. First, I'll make one distinction. It's probably less than half of our communities actually publish their full data set in an open data site or completely online. Shawnee tomorrow will have their open data set, and it's pretty neat. I'll make sure that you have the link to that as well, or Toledo's, where you can see the cost of programs, the alignment of spending with results, but they don't go so far as to publish a complete data set that is open to the public for cost recovery purposes. Some communities do, some communities don't. But I really like your conversation. The point of PBB is to make sure that you all have the opportunity to have that policy discussion. So as you get to the end of your priority-based budgeting experience and you see quartile 1 or quartile 2 programs that are really aligned with the results that you're trying to achieve. And if you're subsidizing a program, maybe it's the golf course, maybe it's a public pool. Boise, Idaho subsidizes a public pool. They just had this policy discussion. They said it's so important to us. It's quartile 1 or quartile 2. It's absolutely appropriate to subsidize it, to use general government resources to offset the cost to our users. That's a great decision, and it's marked in the books, and that's a good use of tax dollars. But at least you've had the discussion, and that's the point of PBB.
I think too that what happens is we don't have all the resources to serve all of the demands on those resources that people would. So there's going to be competition, and there's going to be people that will comment that they don't think something else is a priority, and then something that they think is. But we don't get to revisit that global discussion, quite frankly, unless you kind of do this hard look at those things. Now, what we try to do is, and something that we're pretty strong about, is taking a look at those revenue sources every year. One of the things I think you'd agree with is a lot of those fee-based revenues, they don't get looked at. And so 5 years will go by, and then somebody will take a look and try to determine, and sometimes it's a very informal, if any, kind of policy that says how much they're supposed to be covering. And by the way, there's state law across the country, and there's judicial decisions across the country that don't allow you to actually make a profit. You're supposed to be able to recover your cost, and some states, I will tell you from experience, will come after you if in fact they suspect that you're actually going beyond that. Now, the fees that you charge, like in a utility, they get driven back into that utility. So it's hard for me to suggest that that's necessarily a profit, because a lot of times you have to have certain coverage ratios on your bonds so that you have more than enough to ensure that bond is covered when the debt payment is due. So they'll actually require that, because it's, this year we're selling a lot of water, okay, but next year, it might be raining all the time and you won't sell as much water, and so those things can shift on you as to how much you return to retained earnings or whatever you describe that amount is. So I would tell you, though, that I think our whole discussion just about priorities, in the last couple of years has gotten a lot more significant in terms of what you folks have described as your priorities. And that was really your first take at a strategic plan in I don't know how many years. And I'll bet that already some of you are thinking, well, some of those priorities need to shift. Okay, some of that needs to be a bit realigned, maybe not as much emphasis back and forth. You heard comments, about stormwater issues and what those priorities are. Again, sometimes it is dependent on what your perspective is, what your context is, all right? And you're ultimately, the arbiter of priority here in the city. And so you're going to hear all of those things back and forth. But it's better to have those conversations, at least on this annual kind of basis. And I think this gives you some metrics that you can kind of monitor from year to year. And some of those global issues. I was thinking of Stewart, in terms of ending poverty and housing. Those are kind of what I attribute to him in terms of his big priorities, right? And while you may set some of those goals here in town without the belief necessarily that you're going to achieve 100% of those things, those are worthy things to denote as far as a community's kind of ethical behavior or where you're trying to move the community to. And they may cause you to look at things and say, we should charge more fees for this type of thing and maybe not subsidize that as much so that we can do something over here. Because, for example, in the case of housing we know, is such a critical factor for all things related to, poverty issues, education, jobs, all of those things are critical that you have a housing that has some consistency to it for a family to be there, or whoever might, live there. So I think all those issues come into play, and I think you're going to have those discussions as we go forward and maybe change some of your fees and taxes and things and redirect things. And that's a good thing. You need to be reactive that way.
It sounds like this would give us some information that would be the basis for those kinds of things. I have a question on the basketball example you gave. How are you going to allocate the fixed costs? I mean, to me, you can see what you charge and you can see what you pay for staff, but what about the utilities and the bond payments and all that stuff? Is that factored into that?
It absolutely is. And then again, it becomes a policy discussion. So, I mean, these are the costs. This is your true cost of doing business overall.
I'm just really amazed that you can get that to that level of detail. It sounds like it's a very
trust me, we're going to be doing that work.
Yeah.
It's labor intensive.
Well, what I'm saying,
but the staff and all the departments is going to have to generate a lot of that work.
I mean, this is a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, there's...
Yeah, it's
how deep you want to dive into it.
All done in 1 year. So that's why we've sent people to training and all of this and started to get them thinking about how we implement that, because we're spreading across a lot of people to get that information pulled together in a consistent way.
Yeah. Another thing that you mentioned is you look at everything where you charge for service. What about where you don't charge for service?
Great question.
I mean, that's like the golf tennis thing we've talked about.
Yeah. So those programs will show zero cost recovery. There's no revenue being allocated there. And it's equally as much of an important policy discussion as well. Oftentimes we'll have organizations come back and they'll say, we've been allowed to charge a particular fee, but we never did because we always thought it just got allocated back to the general fund and it wasn't worth it for us to charge the fee or to even consider it. And whatever the case might be, right? They assumed that 2 councils ago that it was a program that they wanted to intentionally subsidize. There's oftentimes a good storyline, but we just want to bring back the data to be able to say, is it still what you want to do?
Yeah, this also seems like it could be very difficult to communicate to the public. Is that something that the staff is learning how to do as they learn how to do everything else?
I think some of the graphic presentations assist in that process, but the training talks about how you lay some of these things out and how you explain these things in a public way too.
And a lot of times it doesn't get people's attention until you start talking about reallocations.
Yeah.
That's when they're going to like
their
dial in.
program.
I was reminded.
Their program.
Exactly right.
I want to say it was 2015. I attended a community budget meeting, and Casey stood up and handed out a bunch of stickers and said, "Put the stickers on the 20 most important things around the room, and then put this color sticker on if you think we spent too much money there. And everybody got up and said we didn't spend enough money on anything, and nobody said we spent too much money on anything. And it was that kind of aha moment that the fundamental problem is that zero-sum game. That if you want object A to receive more, you also have to tell me object B needs to receive less.
Well, hopefully it's not a zero-sum game, that we can also learn some other ways to augment the resources.
It's a little like that example I mentioned earlier about housing and finding a revenue stream to support affordable housing, and talking to the people that were really promoting that, Justice Matters and others, about what was a realistic goal versus, a desired goal that they had. And I think that's what made that work, is having those conversations and really getting people to understand other parts of the budget and the demands and where money comes from to pay for things, and fees versus taxes, and then the different types of taxes that you might use to fund different things too. So those are good conversations, but you can tell from Chris's comments that he brings a lot of experience from across the country, which is, I think, a big plus in terms of him coming here and talking to us about what other places have done when they face different problems and how they've figured those out. It has to be done in the context of what's allowed here in the state of Kansas, because each state has different financial rules, in terms of budgeting and fees and things that you can generate. But you'll find Kansas, compared to a lot of places, really still allows a lot of city autonomy to make some of these decisions, which I think is a very big positive for what we're trying to do and what you might want to do in terms of changing priorities.
Okay.
Well, I think it's a really good opportunity for us to have a reality check as to what are we really spending our money on. Is it being appropriately allocated based on the programs or fees or whatever? But it's that opportunity.
Yeah, it gives you you have to stop and look. Is this what we really want to be doing?
And I think that fits into the larger conversation that we're having about what is our role. I mean, we do a lot of things. How many of these are really, our role as a city? And how many things are we doing because that's the way we've always done them?
Mayor, if I may add, I know in our last budget discussion, I think Commissioner Snowden, it was you that said that this is the kind of thing that people get frustrated about our budget process. And to kind of go back to your comments about, is it hard to communicate to the public? In some ways, I see this as easier, because a lot of times our budget conversations are, do we give the Public Works Department $20 million or $19 million? As opposed to, do we fund youth sports or aquatics programs or sidewalk maintenance programs? I think that program conversation is a lot easier for someone in the public to digest than just saying, I think about those budget meetings that we had too, where we used to just put the 10 departments up there and say, should we fund the police department more or the fire department more? Well, if you could break it down to those individual programs that the departments are providing, I think in a lot of ways it makes it even more transparent, again, where we're spending our money and how those dollars align with the priorities that you all have identified for the community.
Not only the priorities, but also in accordance with ordinances. Are we spending it appropriately?
And that's typically one of the criteria that as we score these programs, we'll be looking at.
And the other thing I think it does too is when you start to look at things a little differently like that, you start to open up and think about, are there other ways we could provide the same service, okay? Maybe a different cost. Somebody was asking a lot of questions about inspections, okay? Okay, well, you have a department that's completely committed to doing inspections. And, you have inspections being done in the fire department, there's inspections being done in building department. Is there any reason why they can't be doubled up? At least take a look at those types of opportunities and make sure that's the way we want to do them. And that's more of a management role But sometimes you need to challenge management to take a look at that and say, well, maybe there is a different way to do this, and we can accomplish the same thing. You already got a person in there doing this. Can't that person look at some other things beyond just what they're specifically looking at today? So there's other ways that we're going to have to do those things if you want to free up, resources to go after some other priority.
I think one last thing I would want to say is, for at least from a staff perspective, I hope that staff, if they're watching or listening, or as we continue to have conversations with staff, that we key in on the reallocating resources piece, that we're not using this as a way to find out, who are the program or the quartile 4 people in programs that the city can no longer do. It's how do we free up that human power to really get at the priorities that you all have set. And I, as a staff person, find that exciting, that I can devote my time and what I come to the city to do every day towards something that really makes a difference in the community, as opposed to some of those programs that maybe we're just doing because we've always done it, and if we don't do it, no one else in the community will do it, that maybe don't have as a direct link or a direct connection to some of those community priorities.
How long has your priority-based budgeting product been in the market?
I was in local government from 2006 to 2008 when we first did priority-based budgeting, and then at the request of ICMA, the International City County Management Association and Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, our first external implementations began 2008 into 2009.
So about a decade.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about, looking at these 3, I think you had one with 4-year trends on it. So this is assuming that those priorities have stayed the same in those communities. Then tell me about that.
Yeah, great question. So priorities change, right?
Right.
Stormwater becomes an issue, or you have weather events, or safety gets better and the economy becomes an issue. How do you deal with changing priorities? So that's always on the table. And priority-based budgeting begins with this discussion of what are the results you're trying to achieve. So Kalamazoo, putting it out there that they're going to try to tackle poverty, that has not been on the list for quite some time. But now as they're trying to be relevant with the pulse and the direction of the future that they're trying to build, their elected officials are allowed to say, this is important to us, this is a new issue, and how do our current programs relate to that issue? What's beautiful, though, is that yes, you might have an emerging new need like poverty, but by and large, what we have found, at least from our work in a decade, is that you're most likely not going to get out of the business of creating a safer society. You're most likely not going to get out of the business of creating better mobility options. We have not solved those problems yet. Economic vitality or a great quality of living from a recreation perspective or a cultural access perspective. And so what we found is that those results do tend to stand the test of, this is your role. Back to Mayor, you asked this question, what is your role as a local government? It's to look after and be shepherds of making this society safer or healthier and so on. So even when we've seen new emergent priorities come onto the table, the scoring criteria, which I did not drag you into the weeds tonight, but the scoring criteria is each and every one of those results. How does a program impact everyone and to what degree? In addition, there's scoring criteria like, is this program mandated? And how mandated is it? Is it a federal mandate? Is there a state mandate? Is it a local policy? Is it in your charter? Is it an ordinance or resolution? Is it a best practice like the fire department was talking about earlier? Those are different levels of reasons why you do something from a mandate perspective. There's a whole host of scoring criteria that go into the program so that one new emergent result won't take a program that used to be quartile 4 and launch it to the top of the priority ranking, nor will it take a program that used to be really relevant and drop it to quartile 4 overnight. Now we have seen discussions, and I love talking to you guys about this. This is really cool. But you won't see. We have seen this situation where a county, one of our first organizations had a county fairgrounds, and it was quartile 4. And they said, how is this even possible? We're a county. This is the fairgrounds. We have the county fair. It's like integral to our society. And another commissioner said, well, That used to be the case approximately 40 years ago, when we were a very rural county and we had a county fair. And they came to find out that they hadn't had a county fair in over a decade. They said things have changed. It used to be really important, and we carry this memory with us that this is what we're all about. But over 30 years, 40 years, yes, your dynamics will change. They became really urban as a county. They were no longer rural. So you should see that shift. And thank goodness that you'll have a system that you can infuse your priorities, what's really important, and constantly measure, are you putting your resources towards the things that are important? And you might not notice it overnight, but over time you will.
So would it be fair to say that if you want to move beyond level 1 to 2, 3, or 4, whatever comes next, that you would need to maintain similar priorities at the very least? Like, you can't have a wild political shift in order to move beyond that into those more broad collaborative structures?
Man, that's a great question. So I have to say, even in the level 4 communities like Toledo, that is not a walk in the park organization. They have union issues. They have, their economy has been awful. They're right, if you're not familiar with Toledo, it's just a little bit outside of Detroit, and they're very linked to the automotive industry, and they suffered a huge collapse. The strife and the conflict and the political infighting between cities, counties, the private sector, I cannot believe that they are a level 4 community based on how tough things are. It's not nirvana. So what they do have in common is a willingness to say, back to Tom's point about can we offer this program a different way? We only have so much resources among us, the school district, the city, Lucas County, the private sector, and the chamber. They start from that same premise. None of us have the resources that we need. And that's a real secret to all of this, is being able to identify that scarcity issue is beyond the city of Lawrence. It's for everybody in this community.
So you've talked about some really successful communities. Have there been any communities that have failed priority-based budgeting, and why did they, if they did?
Failure, I would say, is too strong a word that I could use. We've had some communities who would say, we have not reallocated resources because there's no pressure, there's no push. And I wouldn't call that a failure. I have to step back and think,
struggled perhaps.
Yeah, sure. If I was running that city, I would encourage them, well, are you sure that you don't have new needs that you're trying to fund? Is everything perfect around this community and you're not challenging yourselves? So we've had some communities who have tinkered around the edges, but who am I? I have to step back and say they have not. I can't apply my judgment and say that they have failed. They have a report card on alignment of resources with results. That's what they bought into it for, so they could be transparent with their citizens, and there's no impetus for them to change, even if I would like them to.
Very subtle answer.
I think a lot of places, I think the point about being in crisis, when you have a local crisis, how everybody comes together and usually addresses those problems. I used to say about Michigan, there wasn't a crisis they couldn't ignore. And partly because it was a cyclical economy based on the auto industry. But when it finally hit, it hit really hard. And they had to figure out all sorts of things that they had to do. The thing that we all have to think about is, you don't want to wait until you have that kind of crisis here, okay, for you to take action about doing things smarter. And that's what I think this sort of tool does. It gets you to think about doing things in, more expansive way. Whether you choose to actually do them is another thing, but I think you're going to pick up some of those things which may give you sustainability much longer than you would have, otherwise thought possible, because you did take those looks, really hard looks, maybe without the crisis. But you don't want to wait till the crisis, because the crisis reduces your options at that point. And you don't want to put yourself in that role.
And I completely agree. I think that I also like to learn from the mistakes of others, so that we don't repeat those. And that was kind of the seed of my question, certainly not criticizing what you do or the program that you have, but how do we make sure that we implement this correctly and avoid red flags or mistakes or easily avoided problems that might arise.
One thing that I'm really interested in is, I was talking with Commissioner Larson at the break, trying to remember when we went to that class, and a couple of years ago, and I don't remember you having the later levels of PBB that had to do with collaboration. So that's really great to hear that you can even move beyond to collaboration with other communities. But one thing specifically here in Lawrence that I've been really interested in is looking at perhaps merging some departments with the county, and how would that configure into something like this?
Wow. So let me fast forward, do a couple of this level 4 stuff, which it's not like these communities had been at this for years and years to go this direction. It started to become obvious. So in Washington counties, Josh Showman is their county administrator. He just spoke at our conference. When they started Counties Without Borders, fancy name, but it's really simple. They are an implementer of priority-based budgeting, which means that they came up with their list of programs and they went through the process to put a cost on those programs. They scored them, of course. And the question that Josh had was, well, I'll try to relate it to what you just described. How would I know if any of our local cities, townships, or neighboring counties provide similar services? His instinct was, yes, we should have tons of opportunity areas. We all believe that. But how might I go out and actually figure it out? And so our test, and this was end of 2016, early 2017, was, well, Josh, the other entities have not gone through priority-based budgeting, and that's okay. Do we believe that, Josh, if you shared your data with them, not publicly necessarily to citizens, but just with the other service providers, would their administration be able to go through and say, yes, we offer fleet services, no, we don't offer dog park. Yes, we offer small business incubator, no, we don't offer motor vehicles licenses and things like that. And it turned out to be surprisingly straightforward. So this idea of program mapping, which is exactly what we're doing in Shawnee, Kansas tomorrow, Shawnee has implemented. In fact, I was just talking to Brian about that. They are now, since 2012, they've gone through this work, and they've tinkered with resource reallocation, and now they've just learned from Toledo and Washington County and a couple of other counties who have gone through this in small cities. Is this how it works? Can we just invite Johnson County? Can we invite our neighboring cities? Can we invite the organizations within, to the extent that we can name them, the YMCA, our hospital, the school district, and see what programs they offer that we might be able to merge? Quickly, Tom's point earlier about, yes, it's proving to be immense, the opportunities to merge with other outside entities, but the opportunity to merge programs or kind of regionalize within has been surprising. Inspections is a great example. Property records management is another great example. Board and commission support is another great example. Maintenance across various parks and land assets is another great example. We see a lot of internal combinations taking place that we weren't expecting.
MSO.
So we're excited about it too. It was not on our radar. It seems like a natural next step in applying this data is looking for these shared services. I'll be very anxious to share with you what happens in Shawnee. We'll know as soon as tomorrow. That's how the workshop. You can come if you want.
I might. What's our general timeline for here in Lawrence?
So depending on when we can get to our contract back in front of all of you, we're actually having Chris come back on Thursday to kind of have some initial meetings with staff. And then once we have the official contract in place, then we'll really get down to work. And as we've talked, we think that it's completely realistic to at least get our level 1 discussions ready for our 2020 budget process. Now, it's going to take a lot of work, as Tom mentioned, and a lot of staff resources and staff time. Fortunately, the fall is kind of a good time for the budget team, for budgeting folks to spend on this kind of a project. But Chris and his staff are also a resource and have kind of outlined the help that they'll be able to give us in terms of some of the tools. One example that I think of is they have a program inventory. So instead of Chuck having to sit down with his staff and come up with a list of all of their programs, he can say, okay, what are the programs that other public works departments in the 100 or 200 communities that are doing this have, and drag and drop to create our list. So there's some tools like that, and I don't know if, Chris, if you want to talk a little bit about some of the other things that you'll do that can help us as we go. But that's kind of our general timeline, is between now and I think February is kind of what we talked about as being when our budget kind of work will pick up. So am I getting at your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's great. Back to your question earlier about avoiding pitfalls. And the last time that you heard a presentation, I don't know when, it was several years ago.
Yeah, I think it was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe it was Casey or Lisa. I guess I've been to 2.
Yeah, he was at the one in D.C.
Yep.
2.5 years ago.
That's right.
Sure he was.
So in the very beginning, just like Casey mentioned, we didn't know we knew that we needed to get down to a level beyond the departments, because just like Commissioner, is it Herbert?
Herbert. I
Call
like
him whatever you'd
All
like
right,
to call me.
sorry.
I like Hebert.
Fabian's kind of French.
Herbert's kind of nice.
Sorry, I was just giving you the benefit of the doubt. So in our earliest days, we had departments, right? You prioritize one department versus another. And we knew our instinct was to get down below a department level. We had to get to program level. However, in our first 10 implementations, we didn't know what a program looked like, you know? How many programs should a department have? Fast forward to today, 200 communities later, we've identified over 125,000 different programs. We have a really good idea of what takes place in a public works department. But we don't start out and say, hey, here's your inventory. We give you access to, here's everybody else who's gone through it. We make some recommendations, avoiding pitfalls, to say, don't waste your time spinning your wheels. It's not really that abstract. Furthermore, not only do we want to give you a head start on identifying that inventory, but if you do it in a way that compares to other programs in the database, you can compare against those programs later and say, how much does it cost Shawnee or Kansas City, Missouri, or KCK in Wyandotte to respond to fires? Are these regional program providers that are worthy to take a look at? So whether it's inventory development, program costing, and that methodology, you're right, it could be a bear if you're tackling these issues for the very first time. How are we going to allocate facility costs and utilities? Well, it turns out if you go through cost allocation enough times, you can come up with some reasonable ways so we know how it's going to turn out, and how are you going to explain this? So we try to help you avoid those pitfalls along the way through inventory costing, scoring, prioritization, and then taking action on the data and helping your departments actually say what they're going to do with this. And ultimately, last point, sorry, is that our earliest implementations would take 12 months to go through. These days, our average is between 4 and 6 months. We continue to try to drive that down further and further. That was part of the point of inviting, the benefit of having Casey attend our trainings last year, is that she starts to get familiar with how all of this works. The more that we can familiarize your staff, and we provide a support system all along the way. So it's not, here's your software, good luck. For each step along the way, we want to make sure you have a successful outcome. That's how we're able to get to a 4 to 6 month implementation.
Yeah, well, Casey's driving it. I'm sure it'll be a great outcome.
We've had them on to management team, talked to a number of our people already, so they're anticipating this.
Is there a ballpark figure as to how much it's going to cost to have this set up, through the?
Ballpark, was it like right around 60, 50, something like that?
Yeah.
Say the lower number.
Yeah, okay.
I thought it was 40.
Yeah, right.
And that's a one-time setup, and then there's an annual software cost that goes on into the future too.
I'm really looking forward to it.
Any other questions for Chris? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it too.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And we also entertain public comment. Okay, well, I guess we're done. Thank you.
Thank you.